Welcome to the module on the meaning of conflict in capitalism. This boils down to the theory of the capitalism which has been pioneered by Marx, and also Marx have considered the conflict theory to come up as one of the important manifestations of capitalism. By conflict theory, Marx wants to explain the political and economic events in terms of an ongoing struggle over finite resources. So, the term the finite resources mainly refers to the endowment of a nation in terms of the finite availability of economic, political and social resources. So, whenever these resources tends to be limited or basically they are restricted, the power or any kind of dominance or any kind of acquisition over the resources create a sort of conflict. So, this conflict is an outcome of political and economic events taken together. Marx has also emphasized on the antagonistic relationship that basically emerges between the social classes in this struggle, and this results to the creation of the powers which can be multi-powers or which can be a struggle or a conflict or a tussle between two important stakeholders of a nation. The first category refers to the bourgeois, which are capitalized or which are the capitalists and the capital owners, and the second refers to the working class, which refers as the proletariat. So, the conflict between these two different groups of the classes make the class struggle or the conflict to be more pronounced, and that is how the capitalistic economies tends to dominate over the socialistic economies in various models of development. So, when we refer to the Soviet model of economic development, we have seen how the capitalist owners tries to dominate with the through MNCs over these socialist owners. So, conflict theory had a significant impact on the 19th and the 20th century, and it has become one of the most important topic or the apt topic for political debates today. So, by the conflict theory we mean that the people who are wealthy and powerful try to maintain their position by any means necessary through repressing the weak and the helpless. So, basically this statement has been taken up from the Marx theory of conflict, which says that the powerful in terms of resource acquisition, in terms of monopoly status, try to acquire over the land and the resources of the weak and the marginalized. And this makes the conflict theory to be more and more pronounced across the globe. Conflict theory's fundamental facet is that every member of the society strives to maximize their own money and power. This is very much in tune with the economic optimization principle, where the objective needs to be reached satisfying the set of constraints, and the constraints is basically the limited resource endowment. So, by conflict theory, it means that every member of the society, whatever be its criteria in terms of economic or socio-economic status, tries to maximize their money in terms of maximization of their resources and power. And in this process, it may happen that they gain by suppressing the weak, or they basically get dominated by the upper sections. So, it is said that warfare, revolutions, poverty, discrimination, domestic violence are all explained by the conflict theory, because these are the different reflections of the emergence of conflict among different classes, among different nations, among different stakeholders of the society. So, any kind of historical development which has come up over a nation and over a longer period of time, either by the democratic rule or by the civil rights, to capitalistic attempts to control the masses is basically opposed to desire for a social order, because whenever any kind of social order is to be envisaged, it is basically driven by the motto of socialism and also the motto of the state as taken up the authority to look after the welfare of the masses. But in the conflict theory, this is very much in terms of private ownership of the resources, in terms of the privatization objective maximization, and making the capitalists to control over the rest of the world. So, thereby it brings in to the most important version of the conflict theory as proposed by Marx. So, as we get into the details of the version of conflict theory, we say that it focused on the conflict between the bourgeois and the proletariat, where we say that each class is made up of a group of people who share common interest and some level of property ownership, because that is how a class structure comes up. So, this basically comes up in a clusters or a consortium of groups where they share the common interest either by profit maximization or by acquiring their private resources and some kind of property ownership. So, the ownership status is very much important within the capitalistic mode of production. The bourgeois is a social class that possesses the majority of the wealth and the power, because they are considered to be one of the most important dominant or the industrial owners of the entire country or of the entire nation. And those considered working class or the poor were included in the proletariat. Basically, they are the labor class who are basically being taken up by these capitalist owners in their modes of employment, or they are basically being served under their dictatorship. So, these two classes compete, and the word compete is of significance because they actually struggle for their existence in terms of social, material and political resources. Basically, the social resource refers to the recognition, the dignity of labor and also the crave for justice. The material resource refers to mainly the food, housing and all the kind of basic necessities of life, and the political resources calls for the voice, the accountability and to exercise their democratic right. So, all this makes very clear that this competition or any kind of struggle is basically a never ending process between these two classes. More importantly, the role of the state or the role of the institution comes in place. So, either through government interventions or through educational basis, because education is one of the merit goods. Also, religion comes up a very important term here, because in terms of various criteria, conflict can also be emphasized or conflict can be underestimated, and for example, reflect this competition in their inherent inequalities and contribute to the maintenance of an unequal social structure. So, whenever we go for any kind of government interventions which tries to ensure justice, or by education or by religion in terms of different stratum of the population, this type of class struggles start or they originate, and thereby an unequal social structure end up. So, that is how the conflict theory becomes more pronounced, by creating an unequal social structure as the consequence. Moreover, Marx have concentrated on some keywords in the conflict theory. One of the major keyword is mode of production and another one is relations of production. So, when we refer to the mode of production, it basically refers to the structure of the production process, whether it is driven by capital intensive mode or it is driven by industrial owners, that calls in place. And when we talk about the relations of production, is basically about the power distribution in terms of dictatorship, in terms of power struggle that originates between workers and factory owners. This is very much important in a country specific, particularly for a developing country or for a less developed economy. This is the source of exploitation in the industrial owners or in the industrial sector, because these powers are exercised or dictated by the factory owners over the workers, and they end up in some kind of industrial disputes or industrial insecurity in terms of job insecurity, in terms of working hours which are hazardous, and also in terms of rights which are not being justified. So, because the bourgeois owns and controls the means of production, profit drives exploitation. Because it is the working class who have the ownership of a larger scale of production, so they are being tapped up by the capitalist owners and they are driven by the profit maximization, and this profit maximization objective is one of the most important factor responsible for creating a kind of exploitation or exploitative practice. So, the proletarians in their arrangement only have their labor to sell and do not own or control capital. So, this capital ownership or ownership of the resources, either economic, social or financial, are absolutely under the dictatorship or under the discretion of the capitalist owners, and thereby the working class are getting exploited, or they are basically having the arrangement of only labor to sell, and that is how a demand supply exchange comes up. False consciousness is another very important term in this Marx ideology of conflict theory. So, when they refer to the world of false consciousness, it means that the proletarians' inability to see a true position within the class system, because within the class system it is very difficult to basically exercise, or even before exercising, to comprehend the power that the working class possess, because in most of the times their powers or their exercising functions are being overruled by their dictatorship. So their existence and the need for existence needs to be stated clearly. A kind of a misrecognition is being given by their control over media outlets that disseminate and normalize information, because any kind of information that comes in is in favor of the capitalist classes, and this class do not even want to comprehend what can be the basis of this power. So there are only a few of the structural constraints that prohibit workers from forming a collective group identity as exploitated proletarians, as Marx defined class consciousness. Because any kind of collective group is being discouraged by the capitalist classes in most of their dictatorship world, because they basically give rise to a public opinion, they give rise to the creation of a union structure, and that is being totally prohibited by this class. So this basically gives rise to different dimensions of this conflict theory. So how this conflict theory comes up and develop? So according to the conflict theory, tensions and conflicts develop when resources, status and power are unequally allocated across the social groups, because different social groups in terms of income classification, in terms of resource allocation, and in terms of possessing a control over the society basically have unequal distribution of resources, and thereby the power or the authority of the resources over the status and this any kind of dictatorship becomes more evident. So conflicts serve as a catalyst for social transformation, because any kind of social transformation which becomes necessary only because when these inequalities or any kind of unequal distribution becomes more pronounced. So in this perspective, control over financial resources and accumulated riches, political sway and influence, one standing in society are examples of power. That means any kind of control over the resources or over the riches are being dominated by one particular section, and that is not being determined just by class, but by many other factors, just by race, gender, culture, religion, among the other things. So it is evident that the conflict theory originates from the economic transformation, originates from the economic acquisition of the assets, but moreover it is triggered by other socio-economic criteria. So according to this conflict theory, by using the ideological compulsion to foster consensus and acceptance of the bourgeois predetermined ideals, the system maintained an unequal social order. So conflict theory is very much deep-rooted in the social order that already is in place and that never calls for equity or justice, that basically encouraging the capitalist workers or the capitalist owners to come over and thereby exercise their dictatorship role over the working class. So Marx believed that these working class socio-economic circumstances have deteriorated over time, and they have grown aware of their class oppression, and basically they were being at the mercy of these capitalist owners. And that is because how the conflict theory has become more and more pronounced over the globe, even with the advent of globalization. To actually proceed on the conflict theory, we thereby note the following assumptions or the driving factors which make it more evident. The four assumptions are competition, revolution, structural inequality and war. So by competition we mean that any kind of lack of resources which has not been optimally distributed, like money, real estate, goods and more, this refers to competition, and that is how the competition comes in force. Secondly, any kind of struggle for the intangible resources in addition to material resources comes up. So these intangible resources basically refer to the power dynamics, any kind of leisure activities or any other kind of emotional issues that also takes up in this particular context. Conflict theories actually contain that almost every human connection and contact involves competition, which is an overwhelming accept, because it is also between the individuals where the conflict come up because of exercising power over the other. So that is how the competitiveness is not only deep-rooted in the economic structure, but also in the human relationships and definitely over the acquisition of resources. The second assumption calls for revolution. This revolution is basically a kind of a social transformation which is being warranted, which means the power dynamics is in the premise, but the groups do not alter gradually, because any kind of change among the groups come up after the conflict comes up, because conflict is basically the first factor or the causal factor, and the effect can be on a kind of a transformation. So changes in the power dynamics are very much rapid and enormous rather than gradual and evolutionary, and that makes the revolution to be one of the predominant factor. Among them, the most important advent is the power imbalances. It has been said by Joseph Stiglitz that globalization has led to more and more power acquisitions and also creation of inequalities in terms of imbalance in the powers, which is in the societal systems and even in the interpersonal relationships. So certain groups naturally acquire greater authority and reward than the others, and which is more evident even within an organization, within a country, among individuals, and in all spheres of life. So structural inequality becomes one of the driving factor for it. Among them, the most important word that comes in the war. That means war is the outcome of continuing escalating conflict between people, organizations, and whole society, because that is what the end or the consequence that comes up. Because whenever the society grows in a cohesive manner, there is still a conflict with different communities, and that is how war comes as a destruction of the society, and then again creation of wealth or the social reconstruction gets started. So thereby, the evolution of the conflict theory is very much deeply rooted in the social class differences, which means due to the significant population shift, that is from the migration from the rural to the urban or any other migration that comes up, because of the acute poverty of one class who are getting exploited at the cost of others, and definitely a wage disparity and any kind of disparities between the interest of the wealth of the owners and the workers. Conflict theory later appears in the protest against colonial government, the civil rights movement, and the world wars, because these also resulted to some kind of colonial power or power acquisition among the advanced nations of the world, and where the less economies or the less developed economies are worse off. Conflict theory described the formation of a tiny power elite of military, economic, and political individuals who are governing America since the mid-20th century. Conflict theory used to describe class conflicts, which can be due to socio-economic issues like race, gender, religion, culture, and also resulting to a part of a modern social structure. So thereby we can see that conflict may also occur when groups harbor animosity towards one another and not necessarily having opposing objectives. So any kind of unanimous relationship or any kind of consensus cannot be arrived. That also may be one of the reflections of conflict. Even the most important consequence that comes up in visually is the violence, which results from irrational decision making and which becomes highly impulsive and goes against the logical analysis, like any kind of utility theory in terms of economics or any kind of optimization technique where all these rationalities are overruled. Conflict behavior can also include coercive activity, such as a kind of a harming an opponent or any kind of inappropriateness of any logical actions, which are basically qualitative in nature. So we see that when we go by the conflict theory, which arises that it is very much evident from capitalism, but another school of thought has also criticized this important theory. One of the prominent critics of the conflict theory is that it fails to grasp how economic relationships might benefit the various classes involved. So it is said that from the very beginning, whenever the class formation takes place, it takes for granted that it actually encourages conflicts. But this school of thought says that different classes may come up with different ideas, different formation of the society, which can be in micro units, but in an overall unit it can yield benefit to the nation from a macro perspective. Institutions such as pension plans and stock pay can further blur the line between workers and companies by providing people with a vested interest. That means any kind of social protection can also be a better way to avoid the conflict and to make a kind of a protective shield over the marginalized and the poor, and this calls for some kind of social protection schemes. So it ignores how many social institutions can collaborate together and to maintain a good kind of equilibrium. So conflict basically result to bad equilibrium, as it's said by the Marx, but it can also yield a good equilibrium if all the social institutions come together and make a collaborative effort, like family, education, politics and religion. Conflict theory also gets into the focusing on the change while ignoring the societal stability. It takes for granted that the societal order gets disturbed and instability is already inherent, but that may not be always in terms of all economies. So it may not be generalized for all nations across the globe. Inequalities in power and reward are embedded in all social organizations according to the conflict viewpoint, because this is evident because some kind of filtration process takes up where the capitalist or the better privileged groups are filtered out from the system. But that doesn't mean that it always encourages a kind of a violence or a war or any kind of social inequalities. So we can see that the Marx and the class conflict are basically related together. So when we go for the Marx concept of a structure of society, it belongs to the power class, the struggle. Property ownership comes up as definition of a class because that is how the class is defined. Bourgeois property defines social conditions of the mass production, and that is how the class interest becomes a factor where the working class are always competing for the resources and that can be taken over by the capitalist classes. So we can see that the social conditions of the bourgeois production is a theoretical link between different persons, because that is how the class interest comes up. And also it is the battle between the classes where the specific enterprises are involved, and classes are the authoritative relationships between the property ownerships. That is how the property ownerships come up. So in terms of the concept of conflict, as pointed out by the Marx, it is said that regardless of the historical events and the tendencies, the sociological outlines of the Marx theory are extremely valuable. This is because the conflict theory rests on four important assumptions like competition, revolution, inequalities and war. So definitely these are very much evident within a process of historical revolution. And it is said that conflict basically leads to a kind of an unjust social order. So whenever an unjust social order comes up, it is deep rooted within any nation in the course of its development, because every time the filtration process is hidden for any economic structure. So his emphasis on the conflict, which is basically developing from a class creation, which can also result to the relationships among the state in terms of acquisition of the common resources, and most importantly the conflict between the working class and the capitalist owners. So this should not be overlooked, or this should be taken into more consideration in this particular theory. So Marx's theory of conflict very much stands in place, though we can say that it may not be that always class struggle is discouraged or it will lead to inequality over the long run, but actually all the societies, all the government collaborations can come up to ensure that the conflict can be mitigated and also can be resolved. But however, conflict theory is in place, and that looks into basically the tussle between the capitalist classes and the socialist owners, but the government has a role to play to mitigate whenever it ends up with any kind of instabilities either in economic, political or social parameters.